Hello again. We're going to start up, and the person who will introduce our next speaker and panel is not just the Dean of Dornsife, but a visionary without whom the conferences we are holding would not happen. She's committed to the ideal and reality of the academy and the public square, to a university that faces outward, that influences events beyond its gate, and sees to it that scholars and public leaders interact with and learn from each other. She's also a physicist whose field is cosmology, and I'm fascinated by this. She's looked into the first nanoseconds of the universe. I wish I could. I'm really proud to present a good friend, Dean Amber Miller.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us here. 7 years ago this month, an anti-government day of rage set off the conflict in Syria. Cities have been turned to rubble, families have been torn apart, and children, as always, are the most heart-wrenching of the victims. I wrote a profile about a 12-year-old boy named Mohammed, who lives in a crowded refugee camp in Beirut. He and his family fled Aleppo more than a year after a local school was bombed. He was a bright student, a promising student, but today, instead of going to school, he has to work every day to help his family survive. He spends most of his waking hours in a shop that sells household cleaning products for $23 a week. Mohammed has said that when he grows up, he wants to be a pharmacist like his sister's husband, but on the trajectory he's on right now, that's almost impossible. Hundreds of schools in Syria have been destroyed, and fear of attack has closed most of those that remain. Many of the refugee boys Mohammed's age are in a similar situation, while many of the girls are married off by the time they're 14 or 15 to help their families survive. Since 2011, more than 8 million children have been directly affected by the war in Syria, including 2.6 million who are registered refugees in other countries. Similar stories are playing out in other parts of the world. Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, South Sudanese refugees moving into Uganda, emergencies in Nigeria, Ukraine, Yemen, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Migration and refugee crises present critical, far-reaching challenges that need to be addressed as an international community. Among these challenges, education, the ticket to a bright future, is too often sidelined. Today, I'm pleased to welcome one of the world's most influential leaders in the fight to make education a right for every young person. We welcome back to USC Dornsife the Right Honorable Gordon Brown, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2007 to 2010. Today, Gordon Brown serves as the UN Special Envoy for Global Education, a position he has held since 2012. Mr. Brown's many years in government continue to shape his views on the importance of education as the fundamental right of every child in the world, as the key to better health and greater social stability. Among his roles as Special Envoy, he serves as the chair of the high-level steering group for the Education Cannot Wait Fund for Education in Emergencies, and chair of the Inquiry on Protecting Children in Conflict. As Prime Minister, just a couple of his major accomplishments: he was one of the first leaders during the global financial crisis to call for strengthening financial supervision and regulation. In 2009, he hosted the G20 summit in London, where world leaders committed $1 trillion to help the world economy through the crisis. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, he served from 1997 to 2007, in which he guided a number of reforms in the UK, including the minimum wage, the child tax credit, and paid paternity leave. And here at USC Dornsife, he's been one of our most valued special lecturers. He spent several weeks with us in 2015 teaching international relations, and he's back again this spring, again teaching to many of our talented and eager undergraduates. We are thrilled to have him here with us today. Please welcome to the podium the Right Honorable Gordon Brown.
Can I say, first of all, what a real pleasure it is to be at the University of Southern California again, to be with your president, who is known throughout the world for his quality and his leadership, to be with Amber, who heads a wonderful faculty, with my friends Bob Schrum, whom I've known for many, many years and who I respect greatly, one of the greatest speech writers I've ever come across, Steve Lammy, who I'm teaching with, and all of you who are here today. You know, the last time I spoke, just as people finished a lunch, and I was the after-lunch speaker, the chairman turned to me as people were enjoying themselves and talking and eating well, and said, "Do you want to speak now, or shall we let people enjoy themselves a little longer?" And it may be that that is how you feel today. I was once a university lecturer, and I know that universities stand for objectivity, rationality, this search for truth, the pursuit of knowledge, all the things I had to leave behind when I went into politics. And it may be that this discussion today is necessary because politics has not brought these qualities to the debates that we're having about the importance of globalization and indeed the importance of immigration. My subject today is to take a global view of what is happening, and I want to put it in perspective what's happening with what I see as the trends in globalization, and then talk about how it affects one of the biggest issues that is thrown up by globalization, and that is migration of people, the freedom of movement of people from one country to another. And of course, as Amber has just said so eloquently, the numbers of children and people who are now displaced from a series of conflicts, environmental disasters around the world. 65 million people today displaced from their homes as a result of conflicts and the ecological problems. You know, in the 1950s, Einstein used to go around the world making speeches about his book and talking about exactly the same things, global issues. And he used to come to Britain when he published his book. And some of you may have heard this. He used to go around the country hiring a chauffeur, a driver, to take him around the country. And they'd go from place to place as he held 15-minute speeches from town to town on his book. The reason he did this, he could give 6 or 7 speeches in the course of a day just driving from town to town. The distances are not that great in Britain. And of course, it was the age before the television, and people really didn't know the public figures as well as they do now. And he'd been giving exactly the same speech about the global problems everywhere he went for 2 weeks. Only he there and his chauffeur taking him around the place. And one night his chauffeur said to him, "Mr. Einstein, you're looking very tired." He was in his 70s by then. "I've heard your speech now on 30 different occasions. I know it off by heart. You're tired. I can go up and give the speech. You can sit in the audience." And of course, it was the days before television and people didn't recognize faces. So Einstein really was tired. So where the chauffeur usually sat in the front row, Einstein sat. The chauffeur came up behind the rostrum, gave a speech brilliantly, knew it off by heart, heard it so many times, sat down to great applause after the speech ended, and was about to get up to move off when the chairman said, "Are there any questions?" So here's the chauffeur on the stage, Einstein in the audience. First question: what is the relationship between quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity? And the chauffeur hasn't a clue what to say. Looks at Einstein sitting in the audience for inspiration, gets absolutely none, and then hits on it. Ladies and gentlemen, this question is so simple, and it's so straightforward. I'm going to ask my chauffeur to come up from the audience and answer the question. Now, Einstein would have been shocked as someone who was a cosmopolitan, who was an ambassador for a global view of our universe. He would have been shocked by the 2 major forces that we're seeing at the moment in the political reaction to globalization: populism and protectionism. I think you've heard this morning from the European Commissioner something about the trends in Europe. We've got 3 forms of populism. We've got illiberal nationalism in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, very pronounced these days, and I think he did mention that. We've got anti-globalization, economic populism, but most of all, we've got anti-immigrant, xenophobic, isolationist populism. And if anybody thought that it was melting away, you just need to look at the Italian elections in the last few days. The biggest party in Italy, the Five Stars movement, formed by a comedian, believe it or not, attacks someone who is banned from standing for public office because of his tax affairs, actually called for an amnesty on tax affairs. He would have been the first beneficiary from it. He led the Five Stars movement for many years. It won 32% of the vote on a program that was anti-European, anti-immigrant, and appealing to the south of Italy for tax redistribution. 18% adding up then to 15% for the Northern League in Italy, a program that is also anti-European, anti-immigrant, but actually appealing for tax cuts. So very little possibility of these two parties getting together. Between them, they get 50%. Berlusconi, the former prime minister, now almost seen as a moderate, but he was advocating at that election that 600,000 people be deported from Italy who had come as asylum seekers and as immigrants to his country. And while Italy cannot form a government, the trend in Italy has been repeated throughout the whole of Europe, partly as a reaction to immigration, partly as a reaction to the job losses that come through technology and trade as they see it in globalization. So in Austria, you've got the far right as members of the government. To Norway, further north, where far right have now joined the government. You have anti-immigrant movements that have been very successful in Britain with Brexit, in France with Le Pen, in Germany with the alternative Democratic Party that owes its origins to what happened in Germany in the 30s. And so populism in Europe takes these forms. It is economic discontent, but the complaint is often that it is immigration and trade, not technology, that is causing the loss of jobs. It is cultural alienation, and the complaint is because of immigration, our country is not what it used to be. The complaint is that the elites have let people down because they're out of touch and don't understand that communities are being destroyed as a result of what is happening in their country. And side by side with populism, we've got what you have also in the United States of America, protectionism. And the rise of protectionism is not simply about trade, although that is a major part of it. It is not just trade sanctions that have now been put on steel and aluminium, on an intellectual property coming from China and elsewhere. It's that there is no trade agreement. There is no world trade agreement. For the first time for 50 years since the Kennedy round in the 1960s, we have been unable to sign a world trade agreement, and it is unlikely that this will happen at all in the next few years. There are 7,000 cases at the World Trade Organization complaining about protectionist measures taken by a whole series of different countries. The Trans-Pacific deal has broken down. The European-American deal has broken down. It is unlikely that we will see a major trade deal. Countries will get together in their own ways to have bilateral and regional deals. But protectionism is the order of the day, and it's not simply, as you know, about trade. The take-back control movements are also about restricting the entry of people into countries. It surprised me to see that while in 1990 the Berlin Wall came down and we thought walls were coming down everywhere, and then there were 16 walls that countries had chosen to erect to separate them from their neighbors, that in the last 20 years, 27 years, there are now 65 walls. There is not only a wall being proposed from Mexico to America, there is a wall being built between India and Bangladesh that is even longer, 2,500 miles. Saudi Arabia's got a wall that they're considering of 600 miles. There are walls in the north of Africa, walls particularly in the Middle East. Hungary was talking about a wall, a fence to separate off from other countries. And so this protectionism is not simply about trade. It's people separating them off from other people who once might have been considered to be their neighbors, who are now considered to be people who are allowing others unfairly, as they see it, to enter their country. And yet, protectionism and populism are, in my view, symptoms of a bigger problem. You might say that Brexit is the problem. You might say that the election in America was the problem. You might say protectionism is the problem, or popular. But I think the problem is more fundamental, and it relates to the theme of this conference today. It is about people's sense that globalization is a runaway train, out of control, uncontrollable, that people think that they cannot win, particularly their children cannot win, in an atmosphere where they feel under pressure and they are looking for answers, sometimes not even now looking for alternatives, looking for people to articulate their anger. And it can go, in my view, in the next 20 or 30 years in 4 different ways. That resentment about globalization and the anti-globalization movements, we can either stick with the status quo. But if we stick with the status quo, then a number of problems arise because the intellectual foundations of the status quo, the Washington Consensus, now seems to have been blown apart as a result of the global financial crisis and the subsequent events. The idea of untrammeled movements of capital, people are now believing that this could be destabilizing, and therefore even the IMF has now come to the conclusion that there's got to be some restrictions. Free trade without fair trade, people now accept, can mean that millions of jobs could be lost. And the consensus that was built around tackling inflation, deregulation, privatization, monetary policy, focusing on inflation, no fiscal action, if at all possible, that consensus has now broken down. So the status quo intellectually is under huge pressure. The second answer to the problems that we face potentially is the Trump position, America first. But it's not only America first, you see. It's China first with a more nationalistic stance. It's Russia first with a more threatening stance, indeed, from President Putin, as you've seen in the last few days, with the first time that chemical weapons have actually been used on the soil of a member of NATO, and therefore the reaction has got to be very strong. You've got India first, because Modi has a very nationalistic policy as well. So you see not just America, but other countries saying that the answer is protectionism. And yet, when you actually look at it, cut off imports, and you also cut off many of your exports, because so many of your exports are made from materials that are imported, intermediate goods and raw materials. Cut off your imports, and you cut yourself out of the global supply chain. So there's no American company, Apple or others, who want to be cut out of a supply chain where most of their production is done in China and in Asia at a far cheaper cost than it would be if done here. Bring companies back to America or bring jobs back to America, and inevitably technology will take over, and robots and tele-robots and teleservicing will replace workers that are seen as too expensive, because there's a true fact about globalization that an American worker using American technology will be more expensive than an Asian worker using the same American technology, because it's that technology that they use today. And so the protectionist answer does not lead us to either the creation of jobs or indeed to a healthier world economy, and it sees everything as a zero-sum game in a world where you need to cooperate to work. So then the answer that people have put forward, and Larry Summers, my good friend, is one of the people that is arguing this. Well, what we need now, he said, and this word is, the phrase is responsible nationalism. The way to deal with the problems that are thrown up by globalization are to understand that we've been too globalist, there's been too much international cooperation. We need to concentrate on what a nation state can do to alleviate the problems that arise from globalization and make people fearful of immigrants or fearful also for their economic security. And so training people to more effect for the new jobs, wage subsidies if necessary through tax credits, some tax reform that would make things seem fairer. And that's the responsible nationalism. The problem, however, is that it is looking for national solutions to some problems that are essentially global problems that need global solutions. If you've got a global supply chain, and if you have got wages paid in one country, they will affect the wages paid in another country, no matter what you do as a national. If you've got climate change problems that arise from pollution in other countries, it affects your country, and you can't do anything without international action. If you've got a problem about inequality in your country, you cannot solve that problem without looking at tax havens and systems of tax avoidance that transgress national boundaries and affect your country as a result of action taken elsewhere. And so it seems to me we come back to this, and this is where I now talk about the problems of migration and how we deal with them. We come back to this. The only way forward is to get the right balance between the national autonomy that we desire and the international cooperation that in a modern world is inescapable and that we need. We need international cooperation to deal with pollution. We need international cooperation to deal with tax and inequality. We need international cooperation to deal with trade, which is, after all, partners coming together, if at all possible, to make an environment in which you can exchange goods between countries. And we need international cooperation even to maintain and sustain the level of growth in the world economy. Now, I could talk then about how we advanced a model of the world economy where you balanced autonomy and cooperation. I could talk about inequality, I could talk about the environment, I could talk about growth, I could talk about trade. But one issue that remains so powerful in popular minds that we've got to address is what's happening on migration and how you can combine the understanding that nation states need to make their own decisions with the necessity for international cooperation and to have an understanding that you need as open a society and economy as possible if the world is to prosper in the future. You see, when I look at the trends in migration, something became very clear to me, that while the percentage of people who now live in the country that is not the country of their birth has remained static for a century at 3%, the figure, of course, has gone up from something like 50 million to something like 250 million. So there are roughly 250 million people living in the countries that are not the countries of their birth. But the big trend in that is that the movement from poor to rich countries has been the most significant of all. So you have south-south migration, and it's very high. You have north-north migration, but from poor to rich countries, 20 million people were living in a country that was not their country of their birth, who had come from a poor country in 1960. 100 million of the 250 million or so are people who've moved from poor to rich countries. And it's interesting, it's not now America that's got the highest percentage of people who are foreign-born staying in their countries. That was true many years ago. It is not true now. It's about 13%. In France, it's 12%. In Britain, it's over 13%. In Germany, it's 15%. In Sweden, it's 18%. In Austria, it's 18%. Of course, in Canada, it's 22%. In Australia, it's 28%. In the cities of Toronto and London, it's 40% now. In countries like Qatar and UAE, it's 80% or so who are foreign-born and living in their countries. But the trend is people are moving from poor to rich countries. You can look at the reasons, what the pull factors are, that these countries are successful and people want to get there, what the push factors are, family position in these countries, demographic trends, rising expectations that lead people to move, poverty in these countries. But the fact is that if you want to be, you are going to be, people feel they will be better off poor in a rich country than rich in a poor country. And that is one of the reasons why it is attractive for people to move. And the biggest trend that I see now is not from Latin America to America and North America, it is from Africa mainly to Europe. And the numbers of people who will move from Africa to Europe over the next few years creates a huge problem of adjustment and assimilation for the peoples of Europe. And when you actually look at the figures, Africa's population will double 1.2 billion to 2.5 billion between now and 2050. The birth rate in places like Niger and Chad is still 7 or 6 per woman of a fertile age. And therefore, the birth rate has not come down fast in many countries of Africa. The numbers of people who are already seeking to move from Africa to Europe illegally as well as legally are rising very fast. But if you see the population double, the working population double, the youth population double, then the pressures on Europe. Nigeria is going to go up from 170 million to 400 million people by 250. Kenya from 40 million to nearly 100 million. And you can see the pressures building up at a rate that are far faster and far more profound than even the fastest rates of immigration from Mexico to America some years ago. And then the third factor, and then I want to suggest what we do about it, is of course what Amber said with such eloquence, the numbers of dispossessed people around the world who are looking for a home. These people are not voluntarily migrants, they are involuntary migrants pushed out of their country, and the number has never been higher. It is 65 million displaced people, 23 million of them are refugees. There are even more people, 120 million people in conflict zones around the world because there's about 40 conflicts. And yet what we do to help these people is almost minimal in relation to the problems they face. Syria, as we just heard, 12 million people displaced, 6 million people left the country, 5 million people still in the Middle East, only 1 million in Germany and other countries of Europe, but that's where all the publicity has been. But the real pressure is in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, where millions of people displaced are not in camps in the main. They are dispersed across these countries. They have no right to work in these countries. Their children are not in the main getting education, apart from some of the projects that I could tell you about if he had time. And this is a huge problem that shows no sign of diminishing, because environmental disasters will add to the number of displaced, as what happened in Nepal did very recently, and as, of course, as the conflicts seem to last longer and longer, as we have found with the Syrian debacle, but still with Iraq, Afghanistan, and all these other countries in Africa where you have conflict in South Sudan, you have it in Central African Republic, you have it in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, these countries where millions of people have been displaced as a result of war, and sometimes as a result of droughts that force them out of their areas. So you have these three problems: the rising number of people moving from poor countries to rich countries, the particular issue of the doubling of population in Africa, and then you've got all over the world, and it includes Asia with Bangladesh, as Amber just mentioned, and Myanmar, but mainly Africa and the Middle East. You have millions of displaced people who are not going to get back to their country in the near future. And so, first of all, I think we've got to recognize that we've misinterpreted the refugee and displaced person problem. People are not refugees in the sense that we used to think, that they're out of the country for a limited amount of time and it's temporary. They're out of the country for an average of 17 years. So you can't think of people as just temporarily displaced, and therefore you think of temporary short-term provision. Secondly, we think of them as therefore unable to work, and the sooner they can get back, the better. Actually, we've got to make provision for people to get jobs and to have a livelihood wherever they are, and not just when they get back to the country. And thirdly, of course, we've got to understand that the financing of this is a problem that we have never been able to come to terms with. You know, the United Nations does not have any guaranteed funding other than a very minimal amount for any of its humanitarian aid. All its peacekeeping is covered by what's called assessed contributions, effectively a tax on member states, and that's about $6 billion a year. Its administration, $2.5 billion or so a year, is covered by levies that are charged on members. But apart from 5% of humanitarian aid, everything has to be raised by a begging bowl every year. And there is no 3-year plan, even although we know now how many people are likely to be displaced 3 years from now. There is a 1-year begging bowl, and that's what happens every year. The UNHCR issues an appeal. This year it's $24 billion. It was $5 billion only 13 years ago in 2005. It's now $24 billion. That's how big the problem now is. It dwarfs everything that the United Nations does in other areas in terms of expenditure. But last year, when they had an appeal for $22 billion, they raised only $12 billion. So they're raising roughly only half the amount of money they need. And the average amount of money they are raising for the people that they are helping is about $150 per person per year, hardly enough to keep people for a week, far less keep people for a year. And that is the funding crisis that we face, because there is no assessed contribution system, there is no guarantee of funding. America is actually pulling out some of the funding at the moment, particularly for Palestinian refugees, and we have a financial crisis that cannot be met. So the first thing we need to do is we need to sort out humanitarian aid and recognize it is far more long-term, it is linked to development, it is about giving people livelihoods, it is about planning over a 3, 4, 5-year cycle and not just a 1-year cycle. It cannot be just a begging bowl. We've got to do something about it. And the same goes for all the NGOs trying to raise $10 billion to add to that humanitarian aid, the problems that they face. The second thing, of course, is we've got to recognize that walls will not solve the problem. If we have massive migration, whether it's forced or whether it's voluntary, just to put up a wall does not seem to make the difference that people claim it is. And we've got 65 walls around the world. We've quadrupled the number of walls, but there are now 50 million illegal immigrants in different countries. 10 or 11 or 12 million, whatever the figure is for America, but India is about 20 million, South Africa is about 5 million. You go around the world and other countries have 1 million each of illegal immigrants, people that are not registered, not documented, but walls have not solved the problem, and walls are unlikely to solve the problem. A second way of looking at immigration is this idea of a two-tier status. And the idea of a guest worker is what's popularized in Qatar and UAE, and of course it's popularized by what Germany did with Turkish immigrants in the 1980s. Again, it doesn't seem to me that while there are many, many ways you can reflect temporary admission to a country, to create a two-tier status in your citizenship or in your membership of a country carries with it huge long-term problems for the future. Yes, you can have arrangements for people that want to stay temporarily, but if you divide people into one tier as against another tier, then you will have more illegal immigration because people will stay illegally if they've come into the country. It will necessarily, I think, affect the wages of people who are in the country because the numbers will force down wages. But I think probably more important, the very aim that you have, which is to integrate people who are in your country into your country, that they learn the language, that they adopt the customs, that they feel at home in that country. If you have got a two-tier status, that can never happen, and it becomes divisive rather than unifying. It would lead to more demonstrations rather than less. So I don't think there's an answer in that. I think the answer probably lies in getting this, as I said, and it's true for inequality, it's true for everything that I would talk about if we were talking about other issues affecting globalization, get the right balance between understanding that you have nation states where citizens want to feel proud of their state and their country and demand the level of autonomy in the decision making, but balance that with the need for cooperation issue to issue. And when it comes to immigration, there is no case in Europe for saying that there are no solutions. Freedom of movement is what Europe has upheld and should continue to uphold. And freedom of movement of workers became freedom of movement of families, became freedom of movement of people generally. But within that freedom of movement, the European Union has not prevented the Belgian government for saying that if you have to register in if you're an immigrant, and you can only stay for 9 months if you are seeking a job and don't get one. Germany forces the registration of people when they come into the country. Switzerland requires that all jobs be advertised at job centres so that local people can get a chance to get the jobs, and bans employment agencies from advertising in other countries and not in your existing country. France bans social dumping, so you can't be paid Latvian wages if you're a Latvian person working in France. You've got to pay French wages. And so there are various measures where you have been able to respect the ability of the capacity of countries to make their own national decisions, and yet at the same time uphold principles that I think are important for the modern world, that if you have freedom of movement of goods and services and freedom of movement of capital, you must be able to show that you are sympathetic to the freedom of movement of people where at all that is possible, and must be able to argue for the economic benefits, as America has found, particularly here in California, of people who come to this country and make a huge contribution both in their inventiveness, what they pay in taxes, and what they deliver to the local economy and are valued for it. So we have this problem. Globalization is not managed well at the moment. We do not have the coordination between countries that is necessary for that to happen. It's true of every issue: immigration, inequality. It's true of trade, it's true of growth, and it's true of climate change, where we've made some advances, but not enough. Now, where are we moving towards? You know, Adam Smith was the most famous economist ever to come out of my country, Scotland. I was actually brought up in the town where he wrote his books, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Our town had this huge seafront which looked out onto the North Sea and therefore to Europe. And Adam Smith was the son of the customs officer, and he saw from the esplanade there that ships were coming in and out of Kirkcaldy in the mid-18th century, his own town, and he could see that it was trade that was boosting the economy and the division of labour that flowed from that, and hence the ideas of trade being the engine of growth that he set out in The Wealth of Nations. But he also wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He always regarded The Theory of Moral Sentiments as a more important book because it talked about people's affinity with each other, their sympathy towards each other. And he said this, he said, if there was a disaster in China and 1 million people died in an earthquake, I have to accept, he said, that if I cut, or a friend of mine cut their small finger and it was bleeding, that to them that would be a far more important issue than the fact that 1 million people had died in China. And he talked about, therefore, the circle of sympathy. It starts with your relatives and friends, and it's concentric. It moves outwards to your neighborhood, to your community as a whole, to your country, and to the world. But Smith was not pessimistic about the future. He did not believe that people would retain only an affinity or a sympathy for the people who were immediately close to them as their relatives and friends. He thought that over time, what would actually happen was that because of information about other countries, like the Chinese earthquake that he talked about, people would know more about it. Communication, people would be talking to each other. He didn't anticipate the internet, but he could have imagined that people would be able to talk to each other and understand each other. And through education, the sophistication of the moral sense, then people would find that that circle of sympathy would extend outwards from the family to the neighborhood to the country to the world. And he therefore imagined a world, even in the mid-18th century, where people were sympathetic to other people because they knew more about them, they communicated with them, and they understood them through education and were sympathetic to the problems they faced. Now, that's, I think, the kind of world we're trying to move towards. You never underestimate the importance of family and community and nation. If you do so at your peril, then you will make the wrong decisions. But you can understand why people who are proud of their own country can see the importance of cooperation with other countries to solve problems that are essentially global problems that cannot be solved simply by local and national solutions. Immigration is one of these problems where we've got to think very deeply about what's happening to displaced people, to refugees, but the trends in migration that mean that poor people are moving to rich countries. So the final point I want to make is this. If we are to avoid mass movements of people, then we've got to be aware of the need for development in the poorest parts of the world. Africa has 15% of the world's population. It will, in time, have 30% of the world's population. It's got less than 1% of the world's manufacturing. It gets less than 1% of the world's investment, even with 15% of the people. It's probably got less than 1%, just maybe over 1% of the world's graduates. It is not in a position to make headway in respect of Germany or countries where people are migrating to unless we can help their economic development move further and faster. I have chaired a commission on education, and what we have found is that even in 2030, the year that the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be met, or should be met, and where we are committed to every single child having quality primary and secondary education by 2030, I tell you, in 2030, there will still be 200 million children in the world who are not even going to school. There will be 400 million children who will be finishing the school at the age of 11 or 12 and never go back into a school. And half the world's children, 800 million, will finish school at an early age without qualifications, unable to use their education to benefit them in a job or in a profession for the workforce of tomorrow. And the reason, of course, is that these countries are not spending enough on education, but the reason also is that if we want to help them, we are still not doing enough to give them the chance of making their education system work. The average aid per child in Africa and in the developing countries, every aid agency, multilateral aid agencies put together, is less than $10 per child per year, not even enough to pay for a second-hand textbook for that child in a school. And if we don't do better, we will have children without opportunity who will be discontented. We'll have economies that cannot move forward. We will have terrorists and extremists, as is happening in parts of Africa, preying on the discontent of young people. We will have migration by people who want to stay in their own country but have no means of staying there because their livelihood is not going to be one where they could escape poverty. So the challenge is not left to these countries alone to take the action. The challenge is for us to cooperate to do something that could actually change the prospects of millions of children. I come back to the point I made at the beginning. There are global problems that cannot be solved simply by national solutions, global problems that need coordinated action, and migration is one of them. Thank you very much. You want me up here? You're over here. That's great. Hi, Jake. Nice to meet you. How are you doing? Good to see you. You want me here? Good to see you. You want me here?
Thank you to Gordon Brown for that inspiring and amazing tour de force, and for that amazing mastery also of policy detail. It's an amazing way to round off this day of very fascinating discussion. It's also a great honor to present this panel today of distinguished scholars and leaders. To my right is Professor Stephen Lemmy, a university leader and director of the Dornsife Task Force on Global and Political Studies. He's taught international relations across the world. He's published several books and articles on international relations theory, foreign policy, analysis, and even more. And he has been a leader in this university of bringing international relations and discussions and interactions, and also bringing students to other places in the world. It's a particular honor to present Professor, oops, the order's different. Particular honor to have with us Pamela, I have to say it in French because we have de l'argie. Okay. C'est bien en français, no? De l'argie.
It's Irish.
What? It's Irish? But what, are you guys French migrants? Yeah, see? Okay. Former senior advisor to the UN Special Representative for Migration, focusing primarily on policy responses to the cross-Mediterranean migration in Europe. She spent 20 years engaged in UN humanitarian response, with particular attention to the needs of women and adolescents in emergency and conflict settings, which is something we mentioned today, which is a big issue. And it is a great honor to have Professor Patrick Weil here, who growing up in France, was a hero of mine. He's a famed humanitarian and French leader. He's the Martin R. Floeg Visiting Professor of Law and Senior Research Scholar in Law at the Yale Law School, and a Senior Research Fellow at the French National Research Center at the University of Paris 1, Paris-Sorbonne. And he's also the president of Libraries Without Borders. And I will add that during Lionel Jospin's government, he wrote some of the most important immigration and migration and citizenship laws in France, the Loi Guigou. And as we have discussed, these laws remain in place. So he's actually managed to confront some of these policies and problems and actually create lasting responses to them. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and discussion of Prime Minister Brown's talk. Perhaps we can just sort of kick this off. I mean, Gordon, you gave us an inspiring speech, but at the end I felt a little, I felt a little concerned because you asked for more world cooperation, which is what we need. Just more education and more world cooperation, and we're moving in the opposite direction. What do we do?
Well, John Kennedy made a speech in 1962, and he said America had had a declaration of independence. It now needed a declaration of interdependence. And I think he was right 50 years ago. And I think if I'm right that protectionism, populism, Brexit and all that are symptoms of a bigger problem, then if we can address ourselves to the bigger problem, then we might make progress. We're not going to make progress by abstract calls for cosmopolitanism at the moment in the way that we would like. But we will make progress if one by one we can show that on issue after issue, you need that cooperation to get things done. So that is where I would sort of place the argument. Now, some may disagree with me and say that we ought to be out there defending a vision of cosmopolitanism, and I'm quite happy to do that. But to get action, I think what we need to do is persuade people that you don't need to submerge your national identities to enable you to solve some of the problems of the world by working with other countries.
Patrick?
Yes, I completely agree with your speech, Gordon, and I would like to give perhaps 2 or 3 examples of how the international and the national could work better. Let me take the example of the southern border here. I remember colleagues at Yale Law School starting a presentation comparing Great Britain, Singapore, and Canada, and then demonstrating something. And I raise my hand and say, you compare 3 islands, of course Singapore and Great Britain, But Canada, in terms of immigration, you don't go to Canada by the north. And when you are in the south, you are in the US, you remain in the US. So you don't have much illegal migration going to Canada.
You don't.
And that wanted to express something, is that the geopolitical situation of the US has shifted without any shift in the law. I mean, the US inherited Great Britain tradition. You still speak of port of entry when you are in Texas. Because
they did kick us out, you know. The Brits were kicked out.
Because you would go to the US by boat until the Second World War. And so you controlled borders at the entrance and nothing on the territory. And then you shifted to a situation like Central Europe, Germany, or France, where you don't have any natural borders, and you keep trying to come back to the past. And what is the past? The wall. The wall is to come back to an island. It is the illusion of an island, as you need cooperation between Mexico and the US to manage migration. And let me give you one story about what we've done in Europe to manage with our neighbors. It's like the green card for seasonal workers. If you are, sometimes you want to come just for 6 months, not for settling with your family. Yeah. But you are afraid you will not come back next year, so you remain undocumented. If you will be assured that the following year you would come back, then you would go back. You would not be staying undocumented. And that will have Mexico, Central America, that will bring human resource to the Californian farms, etc. It will not. So we have to exchange ideas. That is one example. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but one thing I want to add. When we help refugees, because that's our duty, you know, we need to think about the local population. I know you have been in the Middle East, like my NGO. My NGO will develop education programs through a community center we deploy in the camps in Jordan. We don't do one program in a camp without one program for the poorest population of Jordan. Otherwise, you create this tension and this rejection from the national population against international cooperation. Anytime you do something for the refugee, you need to think of the poorest population of your country and help them at the same stage.
I think there's an underlying issue here of establishment of regular means of migration and going back to sort of humane, decent, regular means is the only answer here. But in trying to deal with the irregularity, almost every policy which has been adopted, particularly in the European Union and also now in North America, has actually made the situation worse. You couldn't design policies to make the situation any worse. For instance, you want to have refugees come, you want them to integrate well, become part of your community, get along with their host community, but in most of Europe, the wait for asylum hearings is now 4 or 5 years instead of the 4 or 5 weeks it used to be. But in every country, you're not allowed to work until you have your asylum hearing, yep. Which means that everybody applying for asylum is sitting on the stoop, smoking a cigarette, waiting for 4 years, giving the notion to the host community that all these people are coming are not really refugees. They're just migrants coming here and they want to live on the dole and they want to use our taxpayer money to get free housing and free benefits. And look, they're not even willing to work. So the perception in many European countries, I'm speaking particularly of UK where I was living most recently, is that these are all people, they're coming, they have, you know, devious reasons for being here, they've come here illegally and now they're exploiting us. But that perception is actually created by the asylum policy which is being applied by the government, and that is in almost every European country at this point. Asylum regulations altogether are kind of interesting, and if we say we want to select migrants, as President Trump does, we want to get skilled people, people with initiative, etc., If we look, and I'm coming back to the commissioner's talk earlier about European policy, it's actually a Darwinian contest. If you can cross a desert and survive, if you can swim and survive a boat going down, if you can fight your way across the border, if you can get on the bottom of a train from Calais and get to London, then you can get asylum. Who does this select for? Not older people, not disabled people, not women. It becomes mainly men, which then also contributes to the perception that these are not real refugees or needy people, they're just mainly men. So we've got a bizarre situation where every policy we're adopting is actually making the response by the public harder and worse and feeding the kind of populism that Gordon was talking about.
I've lost track of what the question was, but I don't want to be, I want to offer a different suggestion or a different set of issues, and because I do think that globalization is certainly a driver of some of the issues, but I want to bring up two issues. One is state failure, and failed states and fragile states are real critical issues. And we need to pay attention to those states that are failing their citizens. Now, their weakness and their inability to provide security for their citizens and provide anything, including education, as Gordon pointed out, is a real critical issue, but it's emphasized by perhaps globalization. Our colleague, Manuel Castells in the Annenberg School, talks about the idea that globalization leads to the inefficiency of states, takes away its legitimacy, hurts its ability to be equitable in terms of its policies, and certainly affects the identity of the state. So I think we really need to focus on the nation state and how we can build nation states that are reasonably effective. Otherwise, they are going to become the real drivers. David Petraeus, when he's here, gives virtually the same talk and talks about the idea that the future security issue is ungoverned territory. And I think that's a critical issue. The other thing I'd like to say is something that I wanted to emphasize that Gordon Brown talked about, and that is the institutions. I learned something by working with him in this class, and the idea basically is that he makes the point that we have 1940s institutions dealing with 1940s problems, and we have not reformed or transformed the international or global architecture of institutions that are aimed at dealing these issues. So we can talk about the UNHCR and other organizations, but we have to really ask ourselves the question, are these institutions up to the task of really dealing with the refugee issues and the migration issues that are now plaguing the entire world system?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, this is very interesting. You brought up a whole bunch of points, but there's a kind of catch. Gordon was talking earlier about the lack of funding, the lack of sharing. That brings us back to the 1940s and the idea of the Marshall Plan. I wonder if we need some kind of more aggressive leadership on either helping countries with something that looked like Marshall Plans, or we need them in countries that we're living in now. I mean, for example, Gordon talked about the Circle of Sympathy of Adam Smith. Well, Smith's idea was that you would actually take all this wealth you were earning and pump it into liberal arts education, and it was through learning ethics that you would actually gain empathy and sympathy. These are things that we're not funding, we're not able to fund, we're struggling with this. So how do we make this leap? I'm still sort of, I'm missing that
well, look at Africa at the moment. The German government has actually been suggesting and used the words a Marshall Plan. And they recognize that if they don't do something about helping people stay in their own countries, then they will face a similar crisis as they faced with Syrian refugees 2 years ago. And the head of UNHCR, Mark Lowcock, has just made a speech in Dublin, actually, saying, look, as Steve has said, there are about 40 or 50 states that are fragile, that are in a situation, in a state where you might say they were ungovernable. And therefore, how you actually deliver aid or help them rebuild is a huge issue that we probably haven't given enough attention to. What I do know, that, however, in Africa, is that you're going to very quickly get to a situation where the amount of aid going into Africa from China is going to be bigger than the amount of aid from America. And as America cuts its aid budget and increasingly cuts its aid budget to things like education, then we will find that China's investment in infrastructure, which is mainly aid through loans rather than through grants, and it is focused on infrastructure, and usually with Chinese workers, there are 1 million Chinese workers in Africa, then this becomes a great power struggle as well, and nobody benefits. Now, what I find interesting is that China made a plea for cooperation in Africa. They actually know that their image in Africa is pretty poor. They actually know that if they embark on their own on a series of projects, they actually would not find that they were met with great popularity in some places. So they were making a bid. I was involved in one project, Inga project, which is the Inga Dam. 40% of African electricity could be provided by this one dam, which is so massive and so powerful that it can provide energy for so many millions of people in Africa. But they wanted to go in as a joint project with China and US aid. So here it is possible to have international cooperation, even when countries themselves are suspicious of each other, and you can then raise the resources with Europe, China, and America working together. We could make a huge impact on some of these problems in Africa. So the great power struggle is going to happen. If we don't make proposals for cooperation, then there will be conflict based on that struggle. But there is a way forward, and it would raise resources and raise, in my view, quite substantial resources, which is what is needed in these failed states.
Yes, I think this morning and Gordon Brown's intervention on Africa was contradictory. What I heard that USC cannot so easily recruit the best foreign student now because of whatever rules. And Gordon was mentioning that some, the African countries are losing, their best brain. So I think we should, in that field, create more cooperation, because otherwise, if we continue to say, let's take, of course, you can hire an Indian scientist that will not destroy India. But if you take the 10 best people trained in science in Mali or in Niger, you destroy the elite of this country, of this fragile country. And I think we can change the strategy even at the university level. Let me give you an example. I was amazed a few years ago, and I was in Haiti with my organization. Cornell University has recruited a professor in medicine from Haiti. But instead of having, okay, we take him, it's finished for Haiti, they created a program for him to remain half-time in Haiti and to train students in medicine in Haiti and to create vaccine against the epidemic they face. And so he was in Cornell and he was in Haiti. And I think if we could create an international of university, not anymore doing brain drain and brain exchange, hiring people at the level of European or American salary, but having them continuing to be part of the development of their country of origin.
Very good.
Wow.
I think there's a danger in combining migration and labor migration with refugee movements, because policy responses have to be very different. And often the policy responses have somehow tried to work with them both together. In one sense, globalization has been very successful. More people around the world know about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. More people know their rights. More people who are getting educated know that they can move on and use their skills somewhere else. So I think it's dangerous to think that globalization is a problem for everybody. For the Malian scientist, it's not a problem if he can go and get a job in France now. That's a success for him, for his family, and for his community. So that's a little bit tricky issue. And I was wondering earlier when the commissioner was talking about punishing states that don't take back their people who need to be deported from Europe. Like, we're not going to give them foreign assistance, or we're not going to give them visas. That seems to me really counterproductive. Eritrea will not take back its people. Are you going to say then, okay, we're not going to fund? Well, actually, their policy has been to fund it, heavily to try to stop that migration, which indicates a total failure of analysis of why people are moving. And I think we need a lot more universities working on the actual root causes of the movement itself. And we cannot assume either that better education will stop people from moving, because we know it's not the least educated who move. It is people who do have some education who move. So that's an interesting dynamic to think about, too.
Yeah.
Are we supposed to respond to? Is there a question on the table?
Yeah, I mean, about Marshall Plans, about possibilities.
Well, okay,
How do we-
I'm just skeptical about Marshall Plans, because they're kind of like this big dump of money and that sort of stuff, and it usually benefits those people in the donor countries in terms of building infrastructure, et cetera. I think we need to take the fact that, I mean, we have, at least we have nation states, obviously, that have their own interests, and in international relations, it's always a debate between national interests versus human interest. We have a group of actors in the system, the NGO community or global civil society, which we probably have to take more advantage of, and we have to work with them. And I think we should look at those states that are the sort of the most focused on those who have little in the system, and those are the social democracies. And I don't think globalization ruins those social democracies. David Lumsdaine, about 30 years ago, wrote a book about the idea of who gives the best aid and why. And he looked at the notion is that many social democratic states, they tend to be smaller, want to treat the world like they treat their own citizens. And so we have a number of nationalistic societies that we've talked about today, but we still have countries, the smaller ones, there are populist movements there as well, but we've got, look at refugee issue. You know, the Norwegians are have done a lot in terms of the issue of not just aid, but actually programs dealing with refugees. They work very well in coalitions of the willing, which include both states and non-state actors. And I think the future generations that are really active in global civil society are going to provide the solutions to some of these problems, in spite of what nation states want to do. I mean, if I were advising a student now who wants to be a humanitarian, I'd say, you know, move to Norway or Sweden, you know, they'll get one, you know, or get involved in global civil society. And I think, and I'm not trying to be Panglossian here, but I do think that that's a possibility of the future.
I just want to say that I do understand what Steve's saying about the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was actually very successful, and it did cost the United States, I think, about 2 to 3% of its national income, but it did restore trade between Europe and America, and it was very important for the reconstruction of Europe. And when the Soviet Union decided to stay out of it, they actually suffered as well. And what I'm not proposing is just huge sums of money thrown at a problem. But let me just give you the example of Syrian refugees, which Amber raised in her remarks. So there are 4 million, probably 5 million outside Syria in the Middle East. 2 million of them and more are children. So we managed in Lebanon to get 300,000 children into education by using what's called the double shift system. So it was very cheap because we used existing schools. The refugees were dispersed around the country. It cost us only $600 per head because we had 2 shifts in the schools, one for the locals and then one for the Syrian refugees later in the afternoon, where they were taught in Arabic, where the Lebanese are being taught in French and German. Now, we could have gone to 500,000 children, almost every child in Lebanon, dispersed around the country, if we had the money. We only were able to raise half the money that was necessary for that appeal. Now, the parents who had left Syria were hoping to get back into Syria. They did not want to move to Europe. They wanted to stay in the region. But they felt if they couldn't get their children the chance of an education, and of course, they themselves were unable to get a job in Lebanon and everywhere else because they were banning refugees from having the right to work, then they had no choice but to leave for Europe. So an intelligent policy with a large amount of investment in what are actually where the refugees are more located than anywhere else, which is lower middle income countries, not the lowest income countries, could have a huge effect. And you just feel with President Trump, if you could have taken them to these refugees and they could explain that they were actually getting education. They were not on the streets. They were not going to be prey to terrorist groups. They wanted actually to get back into Syria as quickly as possible. They wanted to be engineers and architects and scientists and everything else just like everybody else. But it needs money, it needs a program, and you need to have a clear sense of what you can achieve. Now, of course, in African countries, many people with education want to leave, and rising expectations is sometimes a bigger reason for them leaving than the dirt poverty that many of their other citizens are suffering. But again, you cannot build these countries out of being a failed state unless you have an education system. So you have to take the chance that you can persuade many to stay, to be doctors, to be teachers. But look, in the countries I know in Africa, whereas in 2050, these are the projections, 80% of young people will be getting higher education in Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and Singapore, all the countries in the East, probably 60 to 70% in America. Even in 2050, the current figure is only 5% of children in these countries will be getting higher education or further education of any value. And so if we cannot begin to invest, now you need the framework, the law and order, you need the governance, but you need to invest, and we need to make a contribution because it's actually in our enlightened self-interest to do so.
Gordon, could I ask where the money came from for that particular program?
Right. The money for Syria was raised by an international conference that we held in London, and we raised about half the money that was needed. Interestingly, and this is, I mean, it's a strange phenomenon, Qatar, UAE, Saudi, Kuwait, it's their region. They are going to face the fallout from these problems, and they have done very little to contribute to this. So it's America, it's Britain, it's the European Union, it's many of the countries of the European Union, some from Japan actually, Korea, and they have been contributors to the Syrian fund, but they have only been able to give half of what is necessary for Lebanon. European Union is giving a lot of money to Turkey now, but that's obviously to prevent migration from Turkey, so that's a very particular arrangement. America is giving money to Jordan because that's key to the Middle East for American policy, but actually there's about 1 million children who are not being educated at the moment, and it's the reason normally in aid tragedies or tragedies you're experiencing is that you don't have the schools, you don't have the teachers, you don't have the capacity. We've got the capacity, we've got the teachers, the infrastructure is actually there. The refugees are in the main, there is camp in Jordan, of course, a big one, but the refugees are in the main dispersed. They can go to the local schools, they can do the double shift system. The problem actually is money.
Mm-hmm. I just want to actually link to two things that were mentioned. One was social democratic states and this model of we could call them intelligent, enlightened Marshall plans. I think this is all right, and I think there's a lot of evidence behind it, and I don't want to be gloomy here, but are we not in danger of being outrun by things like global warming as we try and tackle these situations? I admire the optimism, but I still worry that at the very moment one can start making progress, yet another sort of step is pulled out and things get harder and harder as the climate degrades, as that brings more tension and conflict. I feel like there's a sort of perfect storm. I think many people feel that way and they're scared of it. Is that wrong? Or how do we tackle that?
Well, I mean, I think you introduce another group of refugees, and those would be climate refugees. In the 1990s, Ted Homer-Dixon wrote about the idea of climate change and environmental degradation causing the marginalization of certain populations and what he called resource capture. And in wealthy, powerful citizens in some of these states will take the land and take the places where you can actually live and create these refugees from that. And there's some evidence, and Gordon mentioned it in his talk, there's evidence that the number of refugees from environmental issues will increase and create another group of people that we're going to have to be dealing with. And that's certainly happening in Africa now. If you look at the 4 famines that they asked for money for, which they never got their goal, many of those were environmental refugees.
I think there are also many conflicts creating refugees which have environmental factors at their root, Darfur in particular. Yep. It's a matter of resource competition. I just want to raise a number here to put something in perspective too. If we look at migrants sending remittances home throughout the world. It's about $440 billion worth every year, which is 3 times more than official development assistance. In Africa alone, 35 billion in remittances. Yep. That's sometimes 5 to 10% of the GDP in some countries. So if we're really talking about a Marshall Plan that is somehow going to become of more value than the remittances that are currently going, we're talking about a really huge investment. I would make a plea here for higher education too. Gordon talked about the need for primary, secondary education for refugees, but there are also maybe 200,000 to 300,000 Syrians who were starting university or in university when they were displaced. Most places in the world, primary education is provided in some way, shape, or form to refugees, but higher education is a completely forgotten issue. And people who had finished all but 1/4 of their bachelor's degree in chemistry, for instance, would be sitting in camps and unable to compete. There's been some support by the Germans in particular for higher education for refugees, but often it is to bring people to Germany or bring people to Europe. So I think we have to also support higher education institutions in host countries to expand their offerings for refugees and other visiting groups as well.
Yes, I think the issue of global warming on the creation of a new category of refugee might be an opportunity when time comes to perhaps draft an additional convention or do something that permits to reopen the Pandora box of the convention that nobody wants to open now, because we know that if we open the box, people will want to reduce the right of the refugee instead of increasing them. I just want to remind people that there is no obligation under the current Geneva Convention for any state to admit any refugee on its territory. The only obligation occurs when the person has crossed the border. So it's why when you say, what does Europe do? Europe has no obligation of, Europe has a moral obligation, or other country should, but there is no legal obligation of welcoming people across within their own border. So I think the global warming is so frightening for everybody that if governments say to their citizens, and after all, we can all give numbers, even if the number of refugees or migrants have risen, still 95% of the people in our democracies and in our non-democratic state are not migrants. And when they vote, it is what matters. And so we need to I think that issue might be, we can create support for reopening a conversation at the international level and organize the world response to global warming in all different matters, including migration.
Yeah, I think we've got the 1951 convention and the creation of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Originally, the definition was persecution. So the justification for helping a refugee was that they were persecuted on religious, racial, and other grounds. Since then, the UNHCR itself has extended their work to displaced people who are not necessarily refugees, and to people who are victims not of persecution, but, for example, of drought or famine or earthquakes. In Nepal recently, Africa, drought, and obviously. So climate change help for countries is really vital to the process of helping people stay in their own countries. And obviously, as a result of the Copenhagen conference and the Paris conference, you've got this climate change fund. Again, the problem is that it was $100 billion a year, and it hasn't been financed, despite all the good intentions of the Paris summit. So the mitigation and adaptation that these countries need to do, they cannot get the funding that was promised, and it will soon become an issue of betrayal, that you made these promises and you didn't keep them. Now, that suggests that no money can be found. Look, I think you look at it the other way. You talked about 400 million and more of remittances. The aid budget is 150 billion. The question, it seems to me, is not how you use the aid budget just to give out grants, but how the aid budget becomes the lever for others investing and for getting more partnership agreements between companies and between organizations that are prepared as foundations to do things, and therefore make the money go further. So the 150 billion is not the end of the story. It should be the beginning of the story. We should be far more imaginative. You're the expert on finance. You can give us the ideas on this, but far more imaginative. Social impact funds, very important. So you measure impact and people pay for impact. Companies and foundations, but also investment funds and venture capital funds having their own impact funds and asking people to subscribe to them for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many, many things that we could do to actually make the money that is invested by states in development go a lot further and be far more productive in its use. And I think this is one of the big issues of the next few years.
Politically, do you think that's possible with the nativist turn? Yes,
I think it is possible, because I think one of the arguments against aid is that people say it's wasted or it's not used well. I mean, if you can prove... So we've got this plan at the moment, just to give you an example, for a global education fund. At the moment, the total amount of aid, all put together, is 12 billion a year. We have a plan for a fund for 10 billion, so you would effectively be almost doubling the amount of aid. But that is made up of guarantees from individual countries that then you borrow money on the basis of these guarantees to leverage your resources upwards, just like the World Bank does as an organization. And then, because what you're only able to do in that situation is create loans, you create a buy-down facility where the loans are turned into credits, and you give countries that cannot spend on education and can't get money in any other way, you give them the chance to use that money. So there are innovative ways where you could raise 10 billion tomorrow for educational investment if there was the political will to do it. I don't think the issue is that the countries concerned don't have enough money. I think the rich countries don't have enough money. The issue is there the political will to be imaginative about how we use the resources?
And speaking of money, and speaking of political will, where's Asia? I mean, we know that Asia's doing its big Silk giant roads, belt. And you've already mentioned that the way they invest is actually by loans and often by building sometimes temporary structures of roads and highways and other things like this, or by just buying ports like they do in Greece or in Italy. I mean, I know that Asia's struggling actually with its own problems with their sovereign wealth. China, let's put it frankly, struggling with its own sovereign wealth fund. But do you think there's any will from Asia to actually...
But Asia's got the BRIC Bank, which is really India, China, South Africa, right, Brazil, and Russia. You've got the Asian Infrastructure Facility that's just been created, 100 billion. It's got the Silk Road Fund, potentially 50 to 100 billion. You've got the World Bank operating in Asia. You've got the Asian Development Bank itself. You've got Japan as a major aid contributor. You've got the potential for China to be a major aid contributor. I mean, you've got a number of countries in Asia that have got the resources to invest in Asia itself, from Singapore to Taiwan, small countries, but able to do so. So it is not impossible to imagine Asia. And some countries in Asia that are poor countries have actually been able to get to 100% education for primary and secondary children simply by their own efforts with the help of the World Bank and others. So Asia does not present a picture of total gloom. There are countries that are very poor, and India, for example, has maybe 5 million children out of school. Pakistan's bigger with 7 million. Huge issues got to be addressed there, but there is the opportunity in Asia to bring people together to do things.
Do you think?
You've also got some interesting examples on migration. For instance, Philippines, which is by and large a country that's economy is driven by migration of Filipinos outside, has very interesting policies to support their nationals outside, to protect their rights, to make sure their contracts are correct, to provide evacuation in emergencies, et cetera. And that's a new policy that some other countries are starting to look at as well, and how to support your own citizens who are working outside.
Yeah, and I would take a quite opposite example, Japan. The first time, long time ago, I went to Japan, and I made a study for kind of official. I thought they will have to open, you know, because it will be the choice between declining population or migration. And they have made the choice to keep their door closed. So there are two factors here. The geography, it's an island. I come back, geography is neglected as a major factor to analyze migration, because water, of course, is more difficult to cross than land borders. And secondly, the cultural identity. And so you have here an example of a country who prefers to decline in terms of population numbers, in terms of youth, etc., than to open its door to migration. And I think it's quite interesting to remember that example, because we have also, every of our country, an issue of to redefine citizenship, to include people. It's to say who we are together, not by adding groups, etc., but how we can integrate everybody in a common discourse on a common history and citizenship. And of course, the more we get diverse, the more we have to make transformation in the way we talk about ourselves.
Japan is really interesting. I think it's 2% foreign-born population.
Yeah, and they are the old Koreans.
Compared with 14% in America and United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. But Japan cannot walk away from the world. I mean, you know, in the 1980s, they were investing heavily in Europe. Now their strategy is linked more to China. And so, although you read all the time about bad relations between Japan, China, India, the conflicts within Asia, I mean, it seems to me that Japan and China will have to find a way of getting on with each other. So cooperation will happen over time, because the economics will point Japan in the direction of needing to trade with the biggest country in Asia. Japan actually does give money to international development. I'm actually trying to persuade them to join this fund, so I hope you can help me. And they are keen, particularly on education, and they do quite a bit in Africa. So, you know, while they've got this very homogeneous population, I think they do have now to accept that they've got to be more part of the world.
Do we have time for one more question, do you think? Or, all of this is fascinating and convincing and does give a skeptic like me some hope. Now the question is, how do you sell this on the ground? We're also in the United States of America. No, there are two things. How do you sell this in different parts of Europe? And how do you sell this in northeastern Iowa? I really want to know, because I can take you to northeastern Iowa, and this conversation would not get us very far. I mean, that's just the reality. And I can take you a lot of places that have electoral votes and have Senate seats where this conversation is another planet from the conversation we're going to have in a, I don't know, a Friendly's, some kind of you know, fast food breakfast restaurant in Iowa where everybody eats. I'm really curious. And then the same question for Europe, because I mean, coming out of Central Europe, I was in Italy for the elections. Whoa, everybody I talked to who was not an open, sort of an open progressive, everyone took me aside and said, these immigrants. And I said, where are they? I don't even see any immigrants. This is crazy.
They're in northeast Iowa.
No, they're not, man. Only the Dutch ones, and then, you know.
No, I mean, let me just say something. I think, and Gordon, actually, the whole panel alluded to this. It's the idea that how we have to work very hard to show citizens of our countries how their well-being is linked to the well-being of others. And the people in northeast Iowa may be farmers, and American food aid is probably one of our strongest tools in the world system. So we have to make people more aware of how they can be part, not just of a global market, but they can be part of a global community. And one of the problems we have in our society is that I think many places our educational system has failed. We have one, but we go through an educational system where we have no sensitivity or awareness of the world. We do not develop a global perspective. And so our educational system is still national interest oriented rather than sort of global interest oriented, and we have to work on that. It's not just about STEM. STEM is important, but it's also about developing a global perspective in that sense. So I think we need to work very hard to get that awareness that the well-beings of both populations are linked.
I'm putting my faith in faith-based groups. I think it was mentioned earlier that one of the strongest set of advocates in the U.S. for refugee policy are religious groups who have traditionally been involved in resettlement programs. And I think even in Northeast Iowa, if I'm not mistaken, there's one of the big sort of butchery meat packing plants there, which employs a huge number of Somalis right now,
Really?
and others who are coming there. And what we know is that in communities where there are immigrants and where churches and scout groups and civil society reach out and involve people, people become less fearful. We know that from the Brexit polls too. It was communities that had the least number of migrants who were the most negative toward migrants. So actually having groups to reach out and getting to know other people makes them less fearful of other people. So I would put the emphasis on local communities. How can we support local communities to help with this kind of education process?
I think what Gordon mentioned about, you know, the kids in Lebanon and the parents would like to stay and they don't have any school for the kids, so they move to Europe. It's the same. The same talk we can have in Europe, and you can have it in the US. If you have a relation of confrontation with your southern neighbors, you will have more migration. But if you help the Central American and Southern American get a good school education, if you regulate migration, not in the old fashion, but thinking you are a land border country and not anymore a sea border country, then you can do better in terms of management of migration. Let me give you an example I got from the last presidential campaign. Mrs. Le Pen, during the campaign, said she wants to suppress the right for children, foreign children, to go to school. So I was called on TV and I said, Mrs. Le Pen is an enemy of her own voters. Because what happened to kids who go to school? Stay in the street. Mm-hmm. Do you want kids of 10, 13, 14 years old remain in the street? Is it good for the security? I didn't use security, but it's what I meant. And she had to retreat, because I think instead we should always talk of right going with order. Rights, giving rights. For example, it's the same discourse about health. How we shouldn't pay for this undocumented to go to the hospital. But then if they develop epidemia, we will all be sick because we didn't pay $3 for their health. So, and I was saying, if they are undocumented and they are going to be sent by a judge decision back to their country, that's a different story. As soon as they stay in our country, they have to. The kids should go to school. The sick person should. So you have. I think it's also a way we develop our discourse to include the fear of the population who doesn't like the migrants. Because by connecting rights with security, you can also make them double think about their own prejudice.
Well, I think what gives me hope is that we're discussing this today, and that this university is sponsoring a discussion on a major issue, and that this rational thinking about the future is going on within a major university and will be going on, I hope, within other universities around the country. And what gives me hope is what the professor, what Pam, what Steve, and you have said, because you're putting a view of the future that I think can be made attractive. I mean, what gave me hope was seeing all these children in America out on the streets at the weekend. It was incredible to come from Britain and see thousands of young people so eloquent about a cause that concerned them. And my own view is that it's not just gun control that young people are worried about. They're worried about what's happening to their communities. They're worried about their futures. If anything, education is about a civil rights struggle on behalf of young people. So I'm more optimistic than perhaps your question suggested, but it's because this debate is happening. And okay, politicians, you can throw us all out. And it's, Shelley said that politicians had lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And there may be some truth when you apply that to political figures around the world. But it's not just politicians that are going to change the nature of this debate. Churches, when debt relief was won in 2005 from the America agreed and all of us agreed, and we had 100% debt relief for some of the poorest countries in the world, and it was worth $100 billion, and education and health investment increased dramatically as a result of the cessation of the debt payments that they had to make. One of the big movers in that, actually, Pam, you're right, was the churches and faith groups. There was a minister in London who was a theologian who had huge influence in the American religious community. And he sent out a message on a blog that they had to support debt relief, and a huge amount of the Republican constituency in the States then pushed George Bush into delivering debt relief. And there's no doubt it was the churches and religious groups in the state that had a huge influence on, and not just Bono, by the way, that had a huge influence on George Bush. So millions of people making their voices heard can make a difference, and I don't give up on, and I'm not, I don't lose my optimism about human nature. Of course, it's easy to manipulate fears, but it's also important that you can convey a sense of hope. And what Bob and Steve and you are doing by holding this seminar today is an important element of that, because we can go out and talk about debating these issues in a more rational way than has happened within the political system, and influence the debate in the future. So Bob, Professor of Practical Politics, a great thing to do to actually stimulate a debate that could have a big sort of response over time as people talk about these issues in a more rational and more compassionate way.
Yeah, should we take some questions?
I thought that was the last one.
Andy.
There were some great ideas, that the Haitian example you gave, the aid, but isn't one of the core, and I don't think anybody gave a satisfactory answer to Jake's, can this all happen in the era of nativism? And I don't think it's just much as nativism as people are defining everything as a zero-sum game. So, we just had an appropriations budget. Fortunately, it didn't go along with what the president was, but if you remember when the budget came out, it was cutting aid. And how do we redefine that? Does the Haitian example perhaps suggest a way we can say we can just bake a bigger pie? Because we have a contradiction right now. We say keep them out and keep our jobs in. So how are you going to be able to not have people want to migrate to the rich countries if you're also not going to send jobs to the poorer countries?
Well, let's come back to the Malian who gets a degree and wants to go to France. Of course, his personal will is to, but I never met, among my foreign students, I never met anyone who say, I don't care anymore of my country, I don't care of my family, I am out of it. I feel the opposite. I feel that always, if migrants could benefit from permits that would facilitate circulation between their country of origin and their country where they have a stable residence or even a nationality, they would use it. And we don't do it enough. And if, in addition, they would have a job that would permit to do it, and it is really at the university level that we could do immediately things by favoring the recruitment and then the creation of international faculties in this African country, with people coming for 1 year, then coming back, and then creating an elite that then will, of course, have also primary school, etc. And I know the state of Texas. In the state of Texas Constitution, there is the creation of a university. Many American states, when they are created, say we cannot exist without higher education. And so we have to we speak about state building in Africa, and we take their elite. That's really pulling, and then we say, oh, we have to. I think the remittances are great, but they are not targeted always in the best expenses. And it's where we have to try to figure how to direct the resources to what will benefit to the stabilization and democratic development of this country.
I can't remember who wrote it, but I read an article last week that was talking about the importance of diasporas and the role that diasporas play in terms of economic relations between their current state and their previous state. And it gave an example of Vietnamese in the U.S. While there were sanctions on Vietnam and no trade and no business, things were rough. But when the sanctions were lifted and then the U.S. started trading with Vietnam, it was almost always the diaspora who were investing and establishing those trade relations and training people on how to go and deal with it and going there and talking about human rights for clothing workers and that sort of thing. And I thought it was a really nice example of the role that diasporas play in the globalization, in the good aspects of globalization.
We have an institute here on campus, the Institute of Armenian Studies, and they do a number of different conferences and workshops related to investment in Armenia. And they have a very dedicated staff that works with people who may have grown up in Armenia or came to the United States, et cetera, trying to link those communities to help Armenia develop, as a true contributor to the international system. So I think there are many examples in many different societies where that has happened, and maybe we should be focusing our attention on those groups.
Questions? Sorry, I see you right there. Sorry, at table 10.
Okay, so the idea of societal values impacting refugee policies was mentioned a couple times, like in Japan and in the social democratic countries. And it seemed like Prime Minister Brown implied that societal values will change or fold in the face of economic pressures, or huge economic consequences. But I feel like that implies that these countries are purely rational actors. And you've seen in the US that we aren't just purely rational actors. And so I guess, how do we change these societal values in countries like the US and others that aren't doing enough about refugee crises? And are we only dependent on international pressures and rationality?
I mean, I've found that when you can show people what is happening to an individual child, or what's happening to an individual mother, or what's happening to an individual community, it really does make a difference. I mean, there's not a parent in the world that would not be moved when they see a child suffering from a condition that was curable, if they had the medical attention, or if they were suffering from being excluded from school, or being forced into child marriage or child labor at the age of 10 or 11 or 12. And I think I've always tried to highlight, so Syria, I mean, when I went to Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey and met children there, I always remember talking to one child, because if you're a politician, you get used to asking kids, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to do when you finish school? Usually if you're in a class, I did a thing actually with Bono once, and we were in a class in Nigeria, and we were asking the kids, and everybody wanted to be different things, like scientists. Nobody wanted to be a pop singer, and Bono was very upset about that. But certainly nobody wanted to be a politician, which is what put me in my place. But this kid, I asked him what he wanted to do, and he said, I want to be an engineer. And I said, engineer? Because it's not sort of computer scientist. No, engineer, he said. And I said, why engineer? And he said, I want to go home and I want to rebuild my country, Syria. And this was a 13-year-old, And it's telling the story of how, the individual circumstances of a child or a person that I think can help persuade people who are not attracted to abstract theories about care or about duties or enlightened self-interest. But you've got to tell it through stories. And to be honest, I think on Saturday at that rally, because I watched some of it on television, they were telling the stories of these children, and that had a more powerful effect than anything. I was involved with Malala, the girl that was shot in Pakistan, and her story was one that move people. There's a girl in Israel who's been put in prison by the Israeli authorities, a Palestinian girl, and there's a huge amount of response around the world. So I think you can move people. I think sometimes we're just too abstract in the way we put our arguments. And I would not give up on our ability to persuade people, even in some of the remotest corners of the world or the least promising parts of the world where you think people will not support you. I think there is a natural human sympathy for people in difficulty, and I think we can persuade people that there are 60 million displaced people around the world, and all of them have a story to tell, and there is a case for helping them. I think that's the way to do it.
Take one more.
Hi, great panel. I have two questions. One, I was curious if there are any thoughts on the benefits of, we have a lot of, every country has a large Department of Defense, a lot of investment goes into that. What about a Department of Peace, and is that something that would be helpful for some of this? That's one. Other question I was curious about, do we have anything to learn from China in terms of, we're talking about like new approaches, and this is a controversial one, but they have a social monitoring. They're starting to roll out like monitoring the whole, everyone, they're from a social credit type of system, but I'm curious if that's something that could be used for some like refugees and migrants on a larger basis in a positive way.
Why are you looking at me?
That's for you.
Whoa. I'm not sure how to answer that question at all. I was going to say, to the last question, I think there's a really important role for communications, for media, for journalism, and for social media in all of these, in all of these areas. And in one sense, there is a kind of social monitoring already going on, maybe an unfortunate type of social monitoring, but it does give me a chance to say something about the new technologies and the role of social media in migrant life and in refugee life these days, which I think is a subject deserving of much more study than it has had. Because the communication between migrants, between host communities and origin communities, et cetera, is very largely mediated by social media right now. And there is a lot that can be done. I know, living in the UK and looking at the Calais crisis and issue, you would not believe the number of Facebook groups of local organizations in the UK who were mobilized to try to support refugees and migrants in Calais. There were sanitation groups, health groups, women's groups, churches, a phenomenal number of groups that helped to mobilize resources and to raise awareness about these individual stories of people, which made people more sympathetic to the cause.
Just a note, there was a really sort of inspiring article when people last week were thinking of dumping Facebook because of Cambridge Analytica. They said, don't do it. So many of these groups depend on it that if you go, we need to improve, but if we pull the rug out from it, you have no idea the damage that will be done. Mm-hmm. That's fascinating that you're...
I want to say something about your Department of Peace. I'm not so sure giving government this responsibility is a good idea, but I do think I'm a strong proponent of some sort of service and figuring out a way of getting young people involved. One of the reasons we stay in universities is because of these wonderful students we have, and there's a sense of optimism, and they have a lot of skills that could be used across the globe to really make a difference. And I think some sort of service, I mean, maybe it's selfish because I was in the last class drafted, but I think some notion of having people serve in some way, and it doesn't have to be a national service, it could be actually a global service, and figuring out a way to encourage kids to do that would be a very important thing, not necessarily a department.
Patrick.
Yes, speaking about peace, I would like to tell you a story. So the second time I went to Jordan for launching the first Ideas Box, which is this cultural center we deploy in camp, I went to Azraq, which is a very far away, isolated camp, and came back to see the UNHCR staff in Amman. And the head of the UNHCR told me this story. We made a mistake in Zatari, where it was the first camp where we didn't created a space for access to education, information, culture. And as soon as the refugees were okay in terms of health and food and shelter, some of them start fighting. In Azraq, which is much more isolated than Zatari, they took from this experience and created a place where people can communicate, access education, culture, connect with their family, and it brought appeasement, if not peace. So I want to come back to your fight for access to education, which is also the fight of my NGO. Access to education, information, not only bring education, it brings also peace. And especially in internal peace for people who have been submitted to trauma, who can then share what have been, we have to think about these people, what they have been coming through, and they need to talk and speak to their family and through movies they created, through art, because they have to express this trauma, and also it brings peace between people. And so I think being here in a university, focusing, of course, on higher education, we always have to remember that education also brings peace.
Just one, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead. Starting from what you said, I think the one thing I keep hearing from everybody, the undertone is education, education, education. No, I mean...
Well, you know,
all kinds.
The interesting thing, just to build on what the professor has done in Jordan, in Lebanon, which is one of the most divided countries in the world, so they can't form a government easily. They've got Shia, they've got Sunni, they've got Christian, they've got many different denominations vying for position and power. When we put money into the Lebanese schools, one of the things that also happened was that there was an intercultural curriculum. So at the age of 9, children had to start learning about other religions. So they did not just learn about their own, they learned about other religions and what was the common ground and why tolerance was important. And so in the most divided country in the world, you're actually seeing an advance because education has made possible not just opportunity for the child for an economic sort of benefit, but also cross-cultural understanding. Of course, it defeats the argument of ISIS, who say that it's impossible to have coexistence. If you can show that people can coexist and can talk easily about the religions and the different views, then you defeat the whole concept on which ISIS is based. I just want to finally answer the question that was put. I think armed forces can play a major part in helping reconstruction of countries. So I don't think the military use of an armed force is the only thing. They've got the skills and the engineering and everything else to help with rebuilding and reconstruction. And we wanted to see, when I was in government, the British Army and armed forces involved in that. China, you asked about China, and just then you can take whatever view you want on China. Is it heading for confrontation? Is it containment should be our policy, or is it cooperation? There's these three positions. Look, I've got no doubt, and I visit China quite a lot, that there are issues about intellectual property, there are issues about security risks if you buy firms in the USA, and these things have got to be dealt with. I mean, look, when I was in China, I was telling the story the other day that the Indian trade minister was there, and he told me he'd gone to this shop in China, an international store, because it was snowing, and he wanted to buy a coat. So he went into this store to buy a coat, and he got it for $200 or $300. It was a cashmere coat, good bargain. But he said to the assistant that he bought it, he said, but there's no label on the coat. There's no tag. I don't know who the maker is. And she said, well, what label do you want? We'll give you Burberry, we'll give you Canali, we'll give you Dior, we'll give you Armani, whatever you want. And he was making the point, of course, the Indian against the Chinese, that the theft of intellectual property counterfeit was actually the manner in which they did. Look, I actually think that we should pursue a policy of trying to understand what they're about and actually, in the end, have far more cooperative arrangements in areas where there is not dispute, where there is not, an allegation about the way they act. And I think on aid, it is actually possible to cooperate in Africa. And I do repeat that. I think in Asia and Africa and in Latin America, where the Chinese are investing heavily anyway, I think America, Europe, and China should be working together.
Okay, great.
I'm sorry, I think we're coming to the end. For me, at least, it's been an amazing day. It's addressed hard questions, has done it respectfully, and to a very real extent has put out a roadmap and a way forward. When I heard your question, my reaction was, regrettably, we probably have to let certain policies or politicians fail before we get to the point where the choices we focused on here, the roadmap that was laid out, can be fully or substantially realized. But you've heard quite enough from me already. So I want to thank our marvelous panelists, not only on this panel, but all day, for the contributions they've made, for a lot of light and an occasional bit of heat on a subject that's become white hot in terms of politics and public policy. What we've engaged in today and what we'll do at other conferences on other days, as Gordon Brown once expressed it, is to explore what sort of country, what world, what future we will shape. I want to thank President Nikias, Provost Quick, Dean Miller, and all of you in the audience who have joined us today. Events like this are at the heart of our mission at the Institute of Politics, and I finally want to thank the staff of our institute and to ask our partner in this venture, Jake Soll, to close this all off.
Well, first, thank you, Bob. And also, thanks to Erica and her staff. They've done a great job. This has been really fascinating. And actually, I think my thoughts come back to a conversation we were having around the table. This book that's been going around, which I think is fairly problematic, Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, in which he said the Enlightenment will create itself. And everyone who was actually in the Enlightenment in the late 17th and 18th centuries knew that wasn't true. They knew it was a lot of work. Kant, in his Was ist Aufklärung, what is enlightenment, said it was a constant argument. It was a constant back and forth of fighting to find the truth. When Rousseau wrote his discourse on inequality, he matched it with his Confessions and Emile. They actually had a recipe, and it gets back to what we were saying. It gets back to literacy and education for empathy. That was the model of the Enlightenment. It is still what works now, and we still have to fight for it. And this is proven to me today. We do not have enlightenment now. We have to constantly fight for it forever to keep trying to get there. Thank you.
I'm trying to persuade your government to join the International Facility on Education. And I've spoken to my father.
Yes, yes.
Did you hear what they said last week?
Spoken to her.
Everyone was there except for Bessie. That's in the boss because she was fighting about American education.
They are getting really scandalous.
I know.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
We're going to all have dinner, right?
Yeah.
I'll talk to you on.